we shall begin. Welcome to the Hazen Building and to the second in the AFLA Seminar Association series of seminars on contact with children. And this is the seminar to look at safe contact in the context of domestic abuse. And there is assembled before you a panel of real experts. So I'm excluding myself from that. You have Rosanne Cubitt, who is the head of professional practice of Relationships Scotland. She's worked for Relationships Scotland for more than 13 years. And as I expect most of you know, Relationships Scotland provides support services, including counselling, family mediation, child contact centres for their 22 member agencies. And Rosanne not only oversees the work of the National Office and provides CPD and supervision support for 90 mediators, but she also does direct work with parents as an experienced registered family mediator. And there in the middle is Anna Mitchell, who has studied and worked in domestic abuse in the field of domestic abuse for 18 years. She was a social worker with the Domestic Violence Probation Project before she was seconded to the Scottish Government as a professional advisor to support the rollout of the Caledonian system. And those of you who are involved with sheriff court practice, particularly sheriff court summary trials, will know that that is an amazing resource in sentencing when there is an issue of domestic abuse. Anne is now involved as the domestic abuse lead officer in Edinburgh's Public Protection Partnership, and she helps to coordinate domestic abuse services across the council, police, health and voluntary sector. And then immediately beside me I have Julie Grant, who is an independent social worker. She's been a registered social worker for 20 years. She's worked as a criminal justice social worker specialising in domestic abuse. She's also supported the development of the Caledonian system, and she's been seconded to the police as the Getting It Right Better Child Coordinator in domestic abuse. And I could tell you a lot more about them, so I'm going to let them speak themselves because they've got quite a lot more to tell you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that introduction and really for this opportunity to talk about safe contact for children. So we're talking about situations where parents live apart primarily because of separation and divorce, and where they are unable to reach a decision themselves, so they seek legal jurisdiction or a decision through the court. So conflict's likely to be high, and what we're going to talk about today is particularly cases where domestic abuse either is an issue or is alleged to be an issue. So as Janice said, I work for Relationships Scotland, and we provide a range of services across the board, and a number of families are referred to us from solicitors in the courts. So for family mediation, about 34% of our cases are referred directly from the courts or lawyers, but particularly our child contact centres, about 70% of those cases are referred from the courts, and that might be for supported contact or supervised contact, generally for children with their non-resident parent. We work on the basis of research. There's a lot of research which points to the fact that children benefit from positive relationships with both their parents, and that's really the kind of ethos. We're very child-focused, but the important thing for today is the part of that sentence, which is wherever safe and possible. So children need to be safe, and the decisions about contact need to be made with a full assessment of that safety. So when parents come to us and refer from the court, we will do an initial individual meeting with them and carry out an assessment of risk, but that's in relation to the service provision and whether we feel it's appropriate. So for mediation, that might be around whether they feel comfortable being in the same room and whether we can manage the process so that they can negotiate on a fairly equal basis. So the problem arises for us across the board is if parents are feeling compelled to come either from the court or their other ex-partner. So it's important that for the other parent and for our own workers that the risk assessment that's been done has been carried out well. Because we know of cases where the non-resident parent is also referred because of an allegation of domestic abuse, and there's question marks about whether that is unfounded or not. So what we're talking about is about how do we work together, how do we join up all the different places that these families are in contact with to ensure that children are safe. I started working with Anna a few years ago on our domestic abuse policy and procedures and training for mediators, and coming out of that became aware of a process that we're going to talk about today, which I think would really support the work that we do and the work of the courts, and would help to make children safer. So I'm going to hand over to Anna.
Hello. I'm going to do a wee bit of history of sort of how we got here, and also just talk a bit about some domestic abuse theory that is quite relevant for the risk assessments. I won't go on too long, I promise. I know theory and history isn't the most interesting subjects at this time of day, but so the story so far, in 2008 there was a domestic abuse delivery plan for children and young people, and the priority area 5 aimed to ensure that children and young people affected by domestic abuse do not experience additional physical, emotional or psychological harm as a consequence of contact arrangements, both court and privately arranged with the abusive parent. So that was something that was in a delivery plan in 2008. I was in the Scottish Government Equality Unit rolling out the Caledonian system, and it's something that I sort of got involved in and stuck my nose into while I was in the Equality Unit. One of the outcomes of that was a meeting that we had in the Borders. So the Borders formed an expert working group, and they got together professionals who were involved in all different aspects of contact and working with children in domestic abuse to develop a short-term working group. And it was reviewing operational issues and practices with representative practitioners just in that one local authority area. And we had somebody there who drew pictures instead of writing minutes. And it's been quite useful because we've used it with working with children to talk about contact issues as well. And there was 2 pictures that were drawn. One was sort of where we are now, and the next one is where we want to be. And this is sort of where we are now. And it's looking at the whole system in relation to contact, not just family courts, but hearings, the privately arranged contact, social work. People were saying, what are the issues around this whole system and process? And what came out of that is the notion that the different systems involved in making arrangements about contact can sometimes be confusing and not integrated. That where there is domestic abuse, victims may be further abused through their children having contact, or through the perpetrator using the systems that are around to further abuse. Where there's domestic abuse allegations, it's not clear how these can be substantiated or assessed, and that children tend to report conflicting feelings towards the non-resident parent, including fear, anger, sadness and loss. They express frustration and fear at not being listened to, and their views not being respected in relation to contact. There's a lack of awareness amongst practitioners about the nature of domestic abuse and the risks around safe contact, and a simplistic assessment of the parent's risk could lead to unsafe contact being awarded or potentially positive contact not taking place. So that's almost what came out of the issues. And this is a sort of nice happy view of where we might like to be. And what that's really asking us to think about is how can we make a system where there's shared understandings and principles, a clarity of processes and pathways, it's more coordinated, where there's training for those involved in making decisions about contact where there's domestic abuse, and just in the top right, there was a focus on risk assessment. So post 2008 and this expert working group, we looked at safe contact training. We had 2 levels of training. One was safe contact agreement and one was a specialist risk assessment training. The safe contact agreement training is quite similar to CAFCAS workers in England, so they've been given training about how to advise the courts about safe options and safe contact. And it trains participants to interview the mother, the child and the father, and carries out a brief risk assessment and recommends where safe contact can be arranged, what options might be available. The specialist risk assessment tool was a 70-hour training, so it was a 2-week training. It took place at the end of 2012, and there was 13 people who attended that training and were trained in the specialist risk assessment tool. Katrina's going to talk more about both of these. Since then, we've had discussions in Relationship Scotland, we've looked at how we can maybe fund a pilot, we've talked to various sheriffs, and this has all been happening in the context of changes in legal aid and family law modernisation. So it's all been almost put on hold, and it's been quite complicated to try and work out, and they weren't completely able to be transferred over to the Scottish context. So in 2015 we did a review of both of the tools and developed the Safe Contact Agreement and the Child Safety Report, so there's information there for you about both of those. And we also met with Janet, who kindly helped us to arrange this opportunity. And really we'd just like to find out more about how we can try and develop this, or if it's something that might be useful. So I'm just going to, having given a wee bit of a history, just going to talk a bit about some of the theory that really helps inform the risk assessment tools. I'm going to talk about Michael Johnson's typologies of domestic abuse. So Michael Johnson was a criminologist in the 1970s, and he carried out research to try and explain why some groups felt that domestic abuse was related to gender, while others argued that it wasn't. So there was feminists in the women's movement who were seeing people turn up in specialist domestic abuse organisations, who argued that the people they were seeing, it was strongly something that was perpetrated by men against women. And then there was also other services and more generic services where there was different people turning up there, and also statisticians who were looking at general population surveys of crime, who were saying that there was gender symmetry in who was doing what to whom. And so there was a bit of a conflict about what might be going on in these different populations. And Michael Johnson did some research into this and concluded that they were really talking about different typologies of violence, and they were in fact talking maybe about different things. So he came up with various typologies. Situational couple violence, which occurs in the context of isolated power struggles, jealousy, or other incidents of conflict, involving one or both parties using verbal aggression and or violence, and that women and men are equal perpetrators of that. So situational couple violence. Separation instigated violence, which occurs for the first time in the context of relationship breakdown and separation. Again, the violence is usually, but by no means always, of a minor nature, and that's also perpetrated by men and women. And I think separation instigated violence is obviously quite important when we're thinking about contact arrangements. Violent resistance occurs when a victim under coercive control uses violence to protect themselves or their children. So where they might not be the primary perpetrator, and they're resisting violence being perpetrated against them. And coercive control, which is the use of multiple tactics of coercion, not always physical violence, in an attempt to achieve and maintain general control of the partner and access to domestic, emotional and sexual services, which is primarily carried out in heterosexual relationships by men. So it's almost saying that actually there might be different things happening at different times. I've always felt quite lucky when I was a social worker in the domestic violence project, that by the time things got to us, we pretty much knew what was going on in that relationship, in that family. And really, when I started working in my role now, seeing people who are social workers who have to deal with the police call-outs that come in, or people in universal services where people just come in, like in Relationship Scotland, how do people find out what's really going on? Because in some ways it's not about statistics, it's not about men or women, it's about saying, if you're sitting with an individual person in front of you, how can you establish what's really going on in that particular scenario? So we'll send out the slides. If you want to be going on to YouTube, there's lots of YouTube links to Michael Johnson that you can click onto, so I'll stop talking about him at this stage. It really relates to another theorist called Edinburgh Stark. He also talked and coined the term coercive control, which is now become legislation in England, and we're looking at in Scotland being a domestic abuse offence, which is quite related to his definition of coercive control. And really what he was saying is that it's a breach of human rights, it's a liberty crime, it's a loss of freedom and ability to make decisions, it's not primarily a crime of violence, the indicators of abuse aren't always physical, it's a crime of intimidation, fear and coercion, and placing someone in a constant state of fear. So he says coercive control is not about what the perpetrator does to the victim, but about what the perpetrator prevents the victim from doing for themselves. And yet again, there's more links to the start. There's a final theorist that I just wanted to highlight. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. David Mandel's developed a model called Saving Together, which is looking at child welfare and where there's domestic abuse. And it really is looking at how we can better assess what's really going on in a relationship and what the impact is on the child. And there's been a number of social workers trained in this because one thing that I think is potentially problematic is when people approach social workers for information about families, sometimes maybe their assessments aren't what they could be, or they say, well, actually it's a closed case, or they don't pass the information on. So if we can make our social workers have quite a good understanding of what the impact of domestic abuse is on children, then I think we'll be getting better information through to the court processes and systems. He always says, let's stop talking about domestic abuse and let's start talking about what we actually mean by that. So really being quite descriptive in the behaviours that we're talking about. In Edinburgh we did a case file audit for domestic abuse, and what came across is that although there was a recognition that there was impact of domestic abuse on children, it was quite generalised. So people would say, you know, we know that there's an impact on social and emotional development for children. And what the Saving Together model is really trying to encourage people to do is think, what is the impact of a particular type of abuse on a specific family and an individual child? So really being able to describe the perpetrator's pattern and down to the impact onto the child. And really it's talking about a wide range of impact. So at the top, and almost at the 9 o'clock, the physical, sexual and emotional abuse directly perpetrated, and also, accidentally causing physical harm as a result. These are things that people really focus on. So if a child's in the room, being held, heard it, seen it, been involved in a physical assault, then people get worried. But actually what this is encouraging us to do is think a lot more widely about what is the impact on a child of having to move home 3 times, of having their mother be depressed or have no friends, or losing contact with family members, or not having a pet anymore, or really thinking a lot more widely about what we're talking about when we're talking about the impact of domestic abuse. The other thing that Saving Together encourages us to do is think about the role of fathers in families and almost gender double standards of parenting and what we expect from mothers and what we expect from fathers. What's come across quite clearly is that we don't train people to engage with perpetrators of domestic abuse. And part of that's because we're asking them to engage with men who abuse sometimes, but then we haven't even really talked to them about how to engage with fathers generally. So there is different issues and expectations that we have in our services around mothers and fathers. So that's almost some of the theory that's influencing. Again, you can go and watch all the YouTube videos about David Mandel, but I'm going to pass on to Katrina, who's going to talk about the actual tools that we're talking about.
Thanks, Anna. So what we want to introduce today is 2 tools that we have that could be used when there is domestic abuse that you really can't explain, that there's lots of allegations, and how can you work it out rather than maybe some of the ways it's worked out just now. So the first tool that we have is a safe contact agreement, and it's exactly what it says. It's an agreement. It's an agreement between the 2 parties. It's not mediation. It's an agreement between the 2 parties about how contact can happen. And the children's views are sought in that, both parents' views are sought in that, and so are the supporters of the family. So that might be the maternal grandmother, the auntie, the sister, the best friend, whoever actually might be the person that makes the contact safe in the short term and in the long term. And there's an assessment part of that, but actually there also is a bit of a negotiation of the agreement, but not bringing the parties together. They're not able to come together to work this out just now. Maybe in the future they can work it out, but not just now. Things are still quite sore about that. And also we will be seeking other information from professionals and family members as well, what they think. So the angry granny, we need to talk to her because she might be the one that's actually making it worse, but she also might be the person that can make it a bit better and actually working out what is going there on. I'm not just picking on grannies, but sometimes there is an angry granny that is making it a bit worse. And sort of safe contact agreement, what it does, it's a summary of the identified issues. It looks at all the possibilities that contact could be. There is an element of risk, it's a risk assessment, bringing all together all the theories about risk assessment and safety of all the parties, of the perpetrator, of the victim, of the children, of the other family members who go to support this, not support it, the new boyfriend, who sometimes gets lost out. But there's quite a lot of evidence that new partners experience quite a lot of abuse and violence as well, and new girlfriends and things like that. What's going to be safe for everybody to do that? And then at the end of it, there's a negotiation and it's signed, and if we can, the family can then use this in agreement together. It doesn't need to be in a court process, it could be done within a performance sector project, it could be done within Relationship Scotland, it could be done within social work, it could be done wherever that setting of that agreement is done. And this is used quite a lot in England. It's used within CAFCAS, it's used within counselling agencies in England. It's quite a normalised thing, and some, particularly in CAFCAS. We don't have it in Scotland, but I actually think it's a very useful tool to have. And there's quite a lot of people who've been trained in this, and this is something that probably everybody in this room could be trained to do. You just need to sort of know a little bit about domestic abuse, but know how to talk to people and how to bring an agreement together. So I imagine everyone in this room could do that. The training's 2 days long, and support with that. And then what we have, there was 13 of us trained in 2012 now, naively, well, if only we had specialist risk assessors in Scotland, then we could do specialist risk assessments like they do in England. But actually, obviously, the Scottish system is so different, but also Scotland at that time, and the family law system was going through so much change at the time that actually I think we were just a little bit too early or a little bit too late. One of the two things happened here. And the Domestic Abuse Child Safety Report, it calls all different things down in England. It's a specialist risk assessment, but we wanted to take the term specialist almost out of it, and risk assessment, but that's what it is. We wanted to, it's a tool, and what it is, it's an analysis of what is going on with domestic abuse. The allegations of domestic abuse, of course there might be no domestic abuse, but somebody's alleged it. Or the conflict between these two parents is so great, nobody knows what is going on any longer. They've been so horrible, they've been so difficult, that actually, even King Solomon himself wouldn't know what to do. And so actually, if there's all these allegations about domestic abuse in there, can somebody from the outside who actually has a working knowledge of domestic abuse, who really understands domestic abuse from the side of the classic perpetrator, from the victim, from children, who actually has been working with domestic abuse for long enough to actually understand all the different types of domestic abuse that Anna pointed out. A situational couple violence, sometimes quite a lot of people latched onto this who've done some training, and sometimes say, well, that's not as bad as coercive control. Well, actually quite a lot of murders that have happened in this situation. Nobody saw it coming. So actually it doesn't tell you that it's not a risky thing, but if that situation happens and then you are being left to sort of work out what's going on, you need somebody to go in and say, in that situation, yes, that happened, Could it happen again? Maybe, maybe not. It wouldn't happen again. We put these situations in, or actually the impact on that child, or the impact on those children because of that situation was this and that, rather than just say it was ongoing domestic abuse. I think what we are often missing is that analysis of domestic abuse. And the other thing, Calvin Bell, who did the training, was a wonderful man, I really respect him. His big thing as well is, this isn't about stopping somebody who has perpetrated domestic abuse from seeing their children. It's actually, how can children have the right to be parented? And sometimes some of our parents aren't that great. But does it mean they can't parent us, they can't be in our life? So actually, are we in a situation where we're stopping people who could parent their children because we're so angry with them, because things they've done we might not like, we wish they hadn't done. And I'm sure if you ask them, they really wish they hadn't done them either. But they want to be in the children's life. The children want them to be in their life, but maybe the other parent is so angry with them, so hurt by them, even traumatised by them, they can't be there. So actually, how can we analyse that to say, actually, if this happened and this happened and that happened, we think this person could be in these children's lives, rather than just say, oh, it's so horrible, you know, in the past, and never again in the future. Can this all happen? So we have, because we're so generalising about domestic abuse, we make sometimes very general statements rather than nuanced, and I really has to be looking at for this family. And I was just saying earlier, a conversation about an only child in a family living with domestic abuse will have a very different experience than a child living with 5 children. They've got other people to go to, they've got there's solidarity there, there's other things you can play off other people. But if you're just on your own, it's like, well, what am I to do? So we need to be able to say that child's experienced that, the oldest child experienced domestic abuse different from the youngest child, rather than just this family has experienced it in this way. So one of the things, how we would envisage how we do this process, so a conversation that still needs to be had, is that in the first instance, perhaps the child, you know, the agreement is done first, in the first instance. And if you can come to a conclusion, if you come to an agreement, that's great. If you couldn't, you said, oh, it's so risky, it's so awful, couldn't get anything to agree with anything, and the risk, I'm so really worried about the risk, then you could go on to ask somebody to do the domestic abuse of the child safety report. And then in the first instance, the person who was qualified to do the child safety report had done the child agreement, they wouldn't charge it, they would be part of the ongoing fee of that, but then you could ask somebody else to come in and look at that. But some cases that are quite clear from the beginning, it's a risk assessment that you need and not an agreement, because we don't know what's going on. And actually there's been cases that went all the way down to the Supreme Court that cost over £1 million, and the landlords down there at the end of it had to say, I don't know what's going on, because it went on for too long, nobody stepped in soon enough, nobody said what was in the best interest of the child, because we were so busy arguing if the domestic abuse existed or not. But actually maybe if somebody had come in and who could analyse it, who had that experience to actually describe what was actually being talked about, maybe earlier on would have been able to establish whether these children could have had relationships with a parent or not, as the case may be. There's complicated issues that need to be fleshed out about information sharing, about the best case scenario when doing a domestic abuse child safety report is that you have access to information, access to social work information, access to police information, and if appropriate, to medical information. If you can't get access to these information because there's not consents for that, you have to then make judgments what that's about. It can't just be based on what that person tells you. It's an analysis of risk, an analysis of domestic abuse. And the thing about risk assessment is when you're doing risk assessment, you have to look at static factors. And static factors, and if I'm telling you my grandma's suck eggs, I'm sorry, but just static factors are the things that's already happened, the things you can't change. It's a fact. So actually, an allegation of abuse, whilst the allegation itself might not be a fact, the fact that an allegation exists is a fact. That's a static factor. And quite a lot of reports that I see from social workers write quite a lot about static factors, about risk. But actually, you and I don't live our lives like that. We're actually quite dynamic. Humans are very dynamic. We're always changing. Things are always different. So actually, dynamic risk factors are things that can make risk go up, but they can also make risk go down. So you may have been an alcoholic for the past 20 years, and you might be violent to your partner. That might be absolutely true. It's a fact. However, 2-3 years later, you've joined Alcoholics Anonymous, you have gone to the domestic violence, Caledonian is it now, you have done this, you have done that, things have changed, and you might have a stable partner. A partner who's got different values and attitudes than what you might have had before. The dynamic part of your life has changed. So that bit needs to be looked at. It can't negate the static factors, but actually it's real, and that's what we're dealing with just now. What you could actually say to that, what happens if he starts drinking again, doesn't go back to AA, splits up with his partner, well, that's almost something new information. But sometimes all what's happening in risk assessments is just look at the past, and there's nothing looking at what's happening in the present. That's very, very real. And I think one of the problems, what happens because of what's happening in the present, there are people who are not getting access to their children because of that. And also, there are people who get access to children who probably should be getting it, if they are getting access to children, should get it done in a very different way. And also some of the issues as well is, you might have that person who has radically changed their life. You believe them, it's true. But the abuse they perpetrated against their ex-partner 5 years ago has left that ex-partner with post-traumatic stress disorder. And the children have been impacted on that. Bringing that person into the children's life and the victim's life will trigger off all those traumatic events again for them. So how do you manage that? I suppose in the past I was really very much off the school of thought is, well, if you behave like that, why you can't have access to your children, you should have thought about that at the time. But actually, as I've matured, I actually realise human life's not like that. And actually for children do want to have relationships with their parents, they really do. They want to do it in a way that feels safe for them, that actually they can predict, and that feels okay for their parents as well. So, one of the things as well, so it's not just about what we can see, it is actually an intersection of risk, the history of violence, substance misuse, the non-violent criminal activity, the mental health concerns of everybody in the family, the children, what's been happening for them. And really, so as I say, it's an analysis of what's going on. So it does involve interviewing both parents, meeting with the child, the children, using third-party information. But the thing about third-party information, what is the good quality of that information? I think what Anne was saying, that training the social workers to be better about domestic abuse. If you're getting, I don't know if there's a technical word, but if you're getting gothy information from other agencies, it's not helpful, because then you haven't analysed that. But sometimes some information you've got. Social work case notes and reports, police call-out information, the criminal record information, medical information if it's necessary. I don't think we need to pry too much into that, but sometimes it does support with consent. We can use psychometric testing, some quite interesting psychometric testing about how truthful people are. And lots of evidence says that there's no such thing as a lie or a truth. It's just about how you manage your image. So when we tell lies, it's actually because you want people to think good about you. And it's about how, and some people want that really matters to them. So I know as a social worker, I spent too much time going, please tell lies, just tell lies. And actually it didn't matter, they were telling lies to me because they wanted me not to think they were a bad person or a bad mum or a bad, why would they not do that? But it didn't help with my analysis, and the research shows that we need to dig further than that, and we can use psychometric testing, not just about telling the truth, but just about actually where they are in their values and things like that. it's not an actuarial report. It's not what you got nine ticks out of 12. It is an analysis. It is a professional judgment report. And any other third-party information, including from relatives and friends and everybody else. Obviously, you need the court, if it's going to court, you need the court to provide interlocutors to do that and to support that. So, really, the next steps, well, we've been trained in it. I think it's a tool. What we haven't been able to work out, we spoke to lots of people. And most people, well, that's a good idea. What we've not been able to say is how could we use this in Scotland? So I think the next section is how could this be used in Scotland? Is it something that we need in Scotland? I think it is something we really do need in Scotland, but how does it fit? So I'm just going to leave it at that chance, if that's okay.
Wow. Thank you so much. It's been a real challenge because we're so used to stereotypes thinking about domestic abuse rather than sort of challenge the nuanced and person-centred approach that you've been talking about. We're so used to, as lawyers, thinking in terms of history and having static analysis versus dynamic analysis you've been talking about. We're so stuck in our people telling lies, this issue of credibility and reliability, which is our stock in trade. So you're saying move on from that to something much more analytic. You're saying there are tools. Well, we could actually start with something here tonight. So what do you think? Open to the floor for discussion. Or is everybody so blown?
Could I ask, with the safe contact agreement, you were suggesting that people in the audience tonight possibly would be able to do that. Is that training available? That we could actually explore that and look at it if we were interested?
It's not, but people needed it and we knew where to hang it.
Yeah, okay.
That's
So
yes.
it could be made available if you knew there was enough
Yeah.
We've got, the people that were trained in the safe contact agreement then went on to training for trainers. So they were not only trained in the agreement, they were trained in training it. So we've got all the material to deliver the training for safe contact agreements.
It's just what agency would do that, who would do that.
Yeah.
Well, you see, Elizabeth is as a safeguarder among many other talents, and therefore, would this be something that the safeguarders group and Children First might just be interested in, we could get them interested in?
Yeah, I mean, well, I wouldn't speak to other people, for other people, but for me, I would think, yes, I think that would be interesting. So, Children First managed the Scottish Government panel with safeguarders, and they do a few mandatory events each year that all the safeguarders have to go to, and they also offer other training that people can go if they choose. So that potentially would be a way of spreading the message.
I was just wondering if this is a good question to ask, is can you position yourself with the other people who do a bit like what you're saying, which would be the child welfare reporter and the expert witness? Is that a valid question?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really valid question. The problem is because it's a tool, where does it fit in? And I think actually there needs to be like almost a discussion how that would go. Because it's not a bar report, it's not like a child welfare report. And it's a bit different from an expert witness report, although the people who are doing them would be specialists in domestic abuse. I suppose it's more like an expert witness report rather than a bar report. If it's going routes that way, but actually, I think actually it could be another choice we could have in Scotland, just because we're not legislating, we couldn't have it.
And there's cost implications of more choices
Yeah.
and more reports, which I think were one of the stumbling blocks initially. And we did think about whether it replaced a bar report or whether or not bar reporters should be trained in the similar kind of tools and also be able to then do more comprehensive reports, not just about domestic abuse. But it's just been one of these things that...
Just to add to the rider then, if I may, you sort of likened it to being a Kafka's kind of equivalent, which of course we don't have.
Only because it's used in there, but it's not necessarily... See, the English system, it fits quite well into the English system. It doesn't fit into our two systems.
The people who trained us trained Kafka's workers, so that's sort of where the training came from originally.
But would you expect sheriffs or somebody in the court, would you like them to be thinking of you as another option?
I think so, yeah. What you don't want is like a barrister, and then a child psychologist, and then the specialist report, and then it's just like they were all arguing about who's got the best report. You know, it is about maybe asking decision makers to be more nuanced in their approach, and also people asking for reports, thinking what is the type of report I'm looking for.
Because if you were talking about child abuse, we have a system long in place where you don't put the child through the same procedure several times for several experts, and you have a unitary system. I would think that would be wise for this version of abuse.
These are very interesting ideas, and in terms of the kind of checklist in particular for the safe contact agreement, without the benefit of training or theoretical insight, I think that's more or less the sort of checklist that we are doing with people that come to Fantasy Fathers meetings and getting into contact with us on a very large number of occasions. It's aimed at helping them kind of lower the temperature in order to be able to engage effectively, and often after what they feel is considerable provocation, but we try and persuade them that it's really important to lower the temperature and think about how to best re-establish or continue the relationship with their kids. There was mention of the coercive control in English legislation, and I know that there have been people in touch with us and who are in touch with families and fathers in England who are interested in pursuing the possibilities that refusal of contact or breaching of court orders could be considered to be a form of coercive control. And there is a very interesting blog site called Pink Tape, which is written by a barrister in England, who systematically demonstrated how coercive control in the form of withholding or disrupting contact with children was specifically edited out of the English legislation. So you can't, in England, you can't use that legislation. So it is something that we will be kind of interested in if it comes up in Scotland to make sure that loophole is at least addressed. And I think the last thing is timing is everything, and I think all the speakers mentioned about how important is timing, and therefore the effectiveness of these mechanisms as near as possible to the beginning of the incidents, so that the process of reducing conflict can begin. And although I notice that even in your slides there is still reference to the non-abuser, and given that even Evan Stark and Johnson describe situational conflict and so on, I'm not sure it's too helpful in the general presentation to have a binary distinction between the abuser and the non-abuser when the rest of the conversation has been about the context and the situation.
I think in terms of trying to get in there early, we've used some of the safe contact agreements in children and families teams, so trying to get it even out with court processes, and social workers referred to Safer Families Edinburgh, and there was people who went on training for that. It's had limited success, partly because, for the reason you're saying, that by the time things sometimes get to that stage, it's already quite complicated, so they weren't able to reach that agreement. And we've started thinking about when there's been police call-outs, maybe during a handover, and that's then been sent to the social work service it might just actually just be the first time anybody's heard of either party, and how we can maybe try and have that referred to as to have a safe contact agreement done. So try and get in there as soon as you find out that there's conflict going on, because the complexities of particularly the specialist risk assessment tools are so complex that there's a small number of cases which might be relevant for that compared to the agreement, which I think is more general.
When we've been talking about these reports in relation to domestic abuse, and I was just kind of thinking of this last report we reference to, I think that would be a really good time for our student training and actually make that quite a specialist report even at the start of court proceedings, because usually at an initial trial review, that's where sheriffs essentially are hearing the party signs and then making a decision to use an initial contact order. So it might be beneficial to kind of have such a report right at the start of any of the contact cases, in order that if they have training such a bar report, because unfortunately I know that the legislation is going to be changing in relation to how bar reporters are trained. If they had the experience in relation, and the training in relation to domestic abuse, as well as analysing what is actually going on, like what you said, that would be something that could be looked at, not just under the domestic abuse umbrella, but in relation to every contact action.
Right?
I do think there's two things there. I think there's one thing about bar reporters and child welfare reporters, the more knowledge of domestic abuse and having the skills to analyse domestic abuse anyway. That would be great across the board and safeguard and all the rest of it. But actually, I think we found this when we did 13 people who trained, 5 of them were solicitors, one of the 5 were solicitors, but they at the end of it said, we don't have the experience that we've been working with, like we've worked with perpetuate programmes, and we've worked with children in recovery, and we've worked with women, so they didn't have that level of experience. They're quite happy though, we spoke to them to use the knowledge to put into their reports. So I think actually there's also about maybe bringing up some of the knowledge, raising the awareness and actually training and analytical skills about domestic abuse, because they can't, everything can be taught. Everything can, if you've got a willing, student, everything can be taught. But I do think the specialist risk assessments is about really, really understanding the different, the nuance, which I think actually
I don't think everyone would want to do it.
people want to do it as well.
It's a 2-week course, and it's also, we're still getting emails from Calvin, because it's all about the research. It's keeping up to date with all the research, so everything that you're saying in the report should be able to be evidenced through the most up-to-date research on domestic abuse risk. So every time there is a new,
there's lots of great lines to get.
a new research, it gets sent and you have to amend how you view it. And it's also, I think, not for a lot of, it's quite complex high-risk cases. Whereas I think the agreement can be used in high conflict as well as domestic abuse, to just sort of try and get a picture of it.
I'm interested to hear whether you think that the changes that were made by the 2006 Act to Section 11, I'm thinking of Section 7A through to 7E, are really quite structured and too monochrome to fit the sort of situations we've been looking at. Do you think they're a tool that's capable of applying? What is what I mean? This is where there's been where the court is considering the welfare of a child and what order to make. And of course, it's bound to take into account domestic abuse, and it's quite a broad definition of abuse, but it's in terms of actions in the past. It's not really taught in terms of dynamic assessment.
I think that's a terribly important point, and also in that context I also was interested in your blunt assessment of third-party information. If you get enough information and what uses it. And I wonder how much that is sometimes to do with the kind of the black and white binary training of police officers who say, well, who are told, well, there's got to be a perpetrator and there's got to be a victim, and so that we can remove the perpetrator. And they need that in some respects in order to do their job at 3 o'clock in the morning, but it doesn't necessarily, but they're not encouraged to reflect. And therefore, when you go to those third-party sources, you might actually get a very, almost entirely misleading picture of the event.
I was seconded to police for 3.5 years, and my conclusion is you didn't want reflecting police officers. It would have been a disaster. Because the thing is, I think the thing about the police officers, they need to be able to do the job that they do, and if we could start asking them to do other things, then it was going to become, it wouldn't work at all. But that's the thing is what so somebody was arrested on that Saturday night. So what? It's a so what question. Why were they? What happened? What's the meaning of that? Blah blah blah. And like
And then what's the impact on
the impact on the child? What happened? Was the child at grandma's? Did the child have to go to grandma's because of that? Rather than that's what happened on that Saturday night, which is often is captured and that's seen as the truth rather than so what was going on then?
What we find with the case file audit for domestic abuse in Edinburgh is we are auditing risk and need assessments, so where there'd be an allocated social worker, where there'd been 3 or more police call-outs in a 6-month period. And what tended to happen is there wasn't really an understanding of what's called the pattern of course of control. So there was a lot of focus on singular incidents of physical violence related to police call-outs that were then sent to the social work department, and that's almost what became the pattern, where there wasn't a really a good understanding or an analysis of the other forms of abuse and control that might be happening in the context. Even when the case files could evidence them, and even when we started looking at information from other people, you could see there was a bigger picture, but there was still these sort of focuses on individual incidents of physical abuse.
And again, that technical term, the guff information. So one of the ones myself and Anna looked at, you had the senior social worker was very clear this was an acrimonious breakdown and an acrimonious divorce. But me and Anna physically read a report that a woman had been locked in a dog's kennel. That's not an acrimonious breakdown in the relationship. But it was never referred to, but it was there. And we saw lots of things from like, oh my, you're reading, what did he, what happened? And the social worker kept going, this is just a divorce going wrong.
I mean, I understand the point about there not being necessarily quite obvious parties involved, but conversely, sometimes what happens is actually it's seen as an easy-peasy thing when the evidence is that there is quite a lot of evidence that there is a perpetrator and there is a pattern of abuse. So it can be flawed. It can be flawed either way. But I suppose when the percentage of when it happens one way or the other, or who does what to whom, isn't important for people who are working with individual family members. When you're sitting with a person in front of you, even if you're able to say 99 out of 100 times this happens, what if you're with the 1%? You know, you need to be able to have a nuanced approach and be able to see the shades of grey to understand what's happening for that person that's in front of you. And sometimes I find, in particular when we're talking about contact, arguments about statistics or gender or things take away from actually being able to really understand what's going on for the people that are there in front of us. They don't help us make decisions sometimes.
And I wonder if in Scotland we're on an incremental learning curve, and so what you're talking about tonight and what's been done with the bar reporters and our child welfare reporters to help them learn more about a complex situation and a different one. So, I could add things to even what you do to say there are other practices that could be added in to make it even better. The bit I want to say before we ended, though, is everywhere else in the world, in many other places in the world, from my studies, there is an identified need for an ongoing coordinating type worker. So as a social worker would be for certain things that social workers do, but this time with family cases where the parents can't go to Rosanne and can't do voluntary anything, they can't find a collaborative mode, you can assess them, but the question would be answered in other parts of the world by having a really followed through working relationship between courts authorising, requiring families to go and get help and work with this person and come back and tell us we've made progress in 3 months' time, or else we'll need to take further steps. That kind of teaming up. I don't know if your proposals are just better assessments, or whether they're tied in with an ongoing working relationship with an authorising court.
Could be if the resources are there. So, for example, it's in Edinburgh, you would be able to say, there are quite there's Relationship Scotland, there's the Safer Families Edinburgh project, there's the Caledonian, but if you're in Forfar, it might be a bit different what you would say. So the problem is that there's not the universality of the services that are really needed for families, and I think that causes one of the biggest problems. So the thing is, it's like safe contact agreement. So just say we took brilliant safe contact agreements, nobody could ever spin them good. What happens if it breaks down in 3 months' time? Where does it bounce back to? Who's going to go in and go, right, maybe the angry granny stayed angry and she didn't stick to what she said she was going to do. And without, I suppose that's what suppose the Scottish Government and all that, who can support these families, even if it's just on the other end of the phone, or who goes out, sort of we'll see, like Grandma said she was going to do that every second Saturday and she didn't, or goes to see the contact centre, won't actually, Baden's 5 now, doesn't want to be in a contact centre, he wants to go to the park with his dad. Who does that? And unfortunately, those resources aren't really there, but I think they are the resources that families really need.
So some of our contact centres do supervised contact, and then we also have some family support workers now that are working in contact centres. And I don't oversee that work, but the person that does has heard about this, and she said that would really help them to formulate a plan to take that contact forward if they could be confident that the assessment that had been done prior to them coming to the contact centre was really broad and had taken all that nuanced approach. So she was really enthusiastic that something like this would be much more
empowering.
And empowering. It would just enable them to support the family better because they would have much more of a broader risk management.
I'm not going to level on saying, can you give us each one thing you think you would like to see? Because this is the 3 wishes thing, psychologist, isn't it? Tell us.
I feel like we're going to be able to see the
Yes, do one each. Do you want to start?
What I'd like to happen, or wish would happen, is that we have the discussion about, is this something we need for Scotland, and is there times to start that conversation? We would like something like this to happen in Scotland, and I'd like to know where you have that conversation. Where does that go? Where does that land at the first conversation beyond this one?
Planting a seed.
I think there's something just about where it's safe for contact to happen that can happen. I just think if we're making decisions now where people who could have contact aren't getting it, or people who maybe where it's dangerous are having contact when they shouldn't, we need to be able to have the tools around to help people make those decisions in a better way.
I think for us we're getting an increasing complexity of cases coming to us, so for us if we could have cases that are referred from the courts, if they'd had a specialist risk assessment done prior to coming out, would be my wish, then we would have, because we're not the experts, we recognise we're not the experts to do that. So that would be my wish.
I think, we'll put those in the stocking. And